Please welcome to the stage, Lucy Cooke!
Thank you.
Thanks, Bex. Oh, is this working? Yeah, it is. Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. So we're going to kick off the QED Festival with some sex. Why not? So I'm here to talk to you about my latest book, which looks at how sexist and heteronormative bias have shaped our understanding of the female of the species. Because Western culture has traditionally had a very binary view of gender. It's a very sort of deterministic idea of what it means to be male and what it means to be female. Here are some of the kind of classic stereotypes that we associate with being male or being female. Males are bigger, they're the promiscuous ones, they're competitive, aggressive, dominant leaders, whereas females are smaller, chaste, nurturing, of course, weak, submissive followers. Now, these stereotypes, yeah, I'm glad somebody laughed, because we're all going to be laughing at the end of the talk. These stereotypes actually have an incredibly long tail, and they date back to my scientific hero, Charles Darwin, who was a scientific genius. I mean, he was, he's the father of evolution and an incredibly meticulous scientist, which is why it's surprising that he had a blind spot. And, he was blindsided by the female of the species. And that's because he was a Victorian man. So when he came to describe females and the sexes in The Descent of Man, which is the book that he wrote, it's a sort of difficult second album that was the follow-up to On the Origin of the Species. And in The Descent of Man, he outlined his vision for sexual selection, which is the force that is basically the struggle for mates, which, as he saw, defines male and female behavior. And in that, he very much saw females as bit part players. Males were the dominant drivers of evolutionary change. They were the promiscuous, aggressive, dominant characters, whereas females were passive and submissive, coy. These are all words that he used to describe them. In fact, he even went as far as to say, man has ultimately become superior to woman. So, and what's really interesting about that is, as I say, Darwin was a meticulous scientist. I mean, he took, I think it was something like 20 years before he published On the Origin of the Species because he wanted to be right. He went off and studied barnacles for 7 years in order to be correct, So it's really important, I think, for us all to realize how influential cultural bias is. Because if even somebody like Darwin can be influenced by cultural bias, it means that it shapes all of our thinking, as I don't need to tell any of you here. But, of course, the problem with the fact that Darwin said this was that it meant that all the scientists that followed in his wake suffered from a chronic case of confirmation bias. And so they either ignored females when they went into the field, or they just saw what they wanted to see, or what fitted within Darwin's paradigm. The trouble with that, of course, is try telling a female spotted hyena she needs to be passive, coy, and chaste, and she'll laugh in your face after she's bitten it off. Female animals can be every bit as aggressive, dominant, competitive, and promiscuous as males. It's just that for over a century, scientists couldn't, or perhaps wouldn't, see them that way. And this morning, I'm going to introduce you to some of the females who have been redefining the female of the species. And we'll start off with the lioness, because this is where my questioning journey began. Because I studied zoology at Oxford. I was taught by Richard Dawkins, and I was taught very much the standard Darwinian paradigm, and made to feel like a loser as a result, because females were evolutionary losers. And about 20 years later, I found myself in the field on a BBC documentary about animal communication, trying to have a conversation with a lion. As you do. It turns out it's not that difficult to have a conversation with a lion. All you need is the recording of a lion's roar, a loudspeaker, and something to hide in. preferably with wheels. So I was in a Land Rover with my speaker and the recording, playing out this tinny roar. By the way, I'm sure a lot of you already know this, but a lion's roar doesn't sound like the sort of majestic roar at the start of an MGM movie. That's apparently a tiger, in fact, because the MGM producers decided that a lion's roar didn't sound enough like a roar. So they used a tiger instead. Actually, the lion's roar is more like a kind of like a sort of noise. It's kind of like the sound that you sort of think Boris Johnson might make at midnight when he's looking for cheese, you know, which I'm sure he does a lot. So we were there, we were making this noise, and I was thinking to myself, well, this is never going to work. This seems so improbable. But sure enough, in the distance, we heard, and then it got closer and louder and louder and louder until out of the gloom emerged not one, but 3 lions. And there were 2 males and a female. And the males, when they didn't see or smell anything that looked like a rival male, they buggered off. But the female, she lay in front of the Jeep, legs akimbo, and pinned us to the spot for over 2 hours. We were stuck there. And it was a lot of time to kill. And I turned to Dr. Seifert, who is the lion expert that I was with, and I said, well, what's going on? He goes, oh, she wants to mate with us. He was German. And I said, well, isn't she mating with one of those males that she just arrived with? And he went, oh, yeah. But don't you know, as a female lioness, she's incredibly promiscuous. She's mating with maybe multiple males, maybe 100 times during her estrus period. And I went, I didn't know that. I was quietly thrilled and amazed, you know, because that is not what I was taught at university. So I sort of, that was like the first inkling that I had that the stereotypes that I'd been taught were not correct. Now, we do know, in fact, why the female lioness mates promiscuously. It's not just wanton lust. She's actually being a good mother. Because as it turns out, male lions are infanticidal. So when they take over a new territory, they will often kill the cubs of the females within that territory in order to make them available for mating. Because if a female is nursing a cub, she's not receptive to mating. She's not actually fertile. So by killing the cubs, the female comes into estrus and is available for mating. It's a pretty brutal strategy, but the females have a counter strategy, which is to mate with all the males that they come across during their estrus, so that the males, if they've mated with a female, they are less likely to then kill her cubs, because they may well be theirs. So it's a paternity confusion tactic. So females are every bit as sexually strategic as males, and that strategy often involves mating with multiple males. And we know that that strategy is adopted by over 60 mammals now, and we know that thanks to the pioneering work of this woman here. This is Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy. And here she is in the late 1970s in India studying langurs. And langurs were the species that she was studying that were infanticidal. She went to actually study, get into the sort of why, there'd been a rumor about male infanticide, and she went to go and study it. And she put 2 and 2 together and worked out that this was actually a strategy by the females, that they were mating promiscuously. And Sarah is, just an absolute force of inquisitiveness and curiosity. And she was really one of the first scientists to properly challenge these Darwinian stereotypes. She was at Harvard at the time, and she's gone on to write widely about how we have defined females according to sexist stereotypes. And when I was researching the book, I wanted to meet her, and I wrote to her, and she's like, she said, yeah, come visit me at my walnut farm. And she lives in Northern California now. And I was really nervous about meeting her because, big cheese academics can be pretty fearsome if you haven't read every single paper of theirs, and they'll test you. And so she's got a pretty giant canon of work, so I was a bit nervous. But she couldn't have been more generous. In fact, she baked me a pie. a vulture pie. Didn't have vultures in it, just had plastic vultures on the top. But that's because she knew I really like vultures, and she'd read my previous book and knew that I was really interested in them. So she was incredibly welcoming. And when she invited me, she said, "Oh, you may well be interested in my house guests too." And I certainly was, because these women are the rabble-rousing matriarchs of modern Darwinism. They are Mary Jane West Eberhard, Sarah Hrdy, and Jean Altman. And these women really fought the scientific patriarchy with hard data and have really redefined what it means to be female. And it was an absolute honor to spend time with them. There's a fourth member of their... by the way, they call themselves feminist Darwinists. And so they don't think that Darwin was all wrong. It's just that he saw the world through a Victorian pinhole camera. And now we're able to look at the sort of the full Technicolor version of life, and it's so much more glorious for it. And there's a fourth member of their crew who's not in that photo, and this is Patricia Goati, who's an absolutely fantastic scientist. And she's also done a huge amount of work into the female of the species. In particular, she was most that I'm going to tell you about today is that she was the very first person to challenged the idea that female birds were chaste, whereas males were promiscuous, which, by the way, makes no sense anyway, because this is what bothered me when I was taught this at university. I was like, so if the males are promiscuous and the females are chaste, how does that work? Anyway, Patty had the same thought. She did something about it. And so she did something really clever. Is back in the early 1980s, she used emerging forensic technology to do DNA paternity tests on a clutch of eggs. Like, she just thought to herself, you know, we think of birds as paragons of monogamy, right? You know, we see them in the garden, and they're like, the male sings and attracts a female, and then together they build a nest and then diligently raise the chicks together. But Patty thought to herself, I wonder if it's all so sweet. She did a paternity test on a clutch of eggs and found that they frequently had multiple fathers. When she went to present, it was the bluebird that she did this test on, which is, of course, the star of Disney's Zippity Doodah. So she's effectively calling a Disney character a Jezebel, which was never going to go down well, let's be honest. But she was even shocked at how her data was received at an ornithological conference. A very senior male ornithologist told her point blank that the only way that could be possible was that the female birds were raped. It's just, there's absolutely no way that the females were, of their own volition, going out and mating with multiple males. So what she did, she pointed out that that's actually impossible, because songbirds don't have penises, they just have cloacas. The male and female both have these multi-purpose holes, and in order for the male to fertilize the female, he's got to balance precariously on her back, they've got to line up their cloacas, and the whole thing, if the female's not interested, she can just fly away. So the idea that the females were being sexually coerced, which is a more appropriate term, is complete nonsense. But that was what the view was for around 10 years. It took another load of female ornithologists to put radio trackers on the backs of birds, trace their movements, and show that female birds were, in fact, flying into other males' territories and soliciting sex with other males before that was finally overturned. And now we know that monogamy is incredibly rare in the animal kingdom. In fact, there's less than 7% of birds are actually monogamous. They do social monogamy very well, but sexual monogamy is another thing. So what about another one of those myths about females? And that's that males are the only aggressive, competitive types. There's nothing particularly feminine, is there, about being aggressive and competitive? Well, that's also rubbish when you look at the animal kingdom, because it turns out the most murderous mammal on the planet, the one that's most likely to kill a member of its own species, it's not me. It's the meerkat. So meerkat society, I've never understood why Meerkat Manor became popular family entertainment, because meerkat society is tense and homicidal. Basically, female meerkats are the dominant sex, and they're incredibly competitive, such that they will compete they live in family groups, and the dominant female will live with her sisters and daughters. But she doesn't want any of those to reproduce, because she wants to dominate all the resources and get them all working to support her reproductive needs. As a result, she will eject any female that gets pregnant, and females are allowed to return to the group if they wet nurse their murderous mother's babies. So there was a study that was done looking into what is the most murderous mammal on the planet, and we came second. Humans came second to the meerkat. Every meerkat has a 1 in 5 chance of being killed by a member of its own species, most likely its own mother or sister. So yeah, this is what meerkat society is really like. It's tense and homicidal. So the meerkat society is described by scientists as a cooperative society, which I've also thought is a bit of a euphemism. Cooperation, it's just not very terribly cooperative. Of course, the queens of the cooperative lifestyle are the social insects. Termites have really taken it to the next level. Here we can see a queen termite whose body becomes incredibly distended in order to just pump out eggs. And she can't do anything else other than lay eggs, and is serviced by the rest of the community in order to achieve that. And social insects, of course, have been much loved by sci-fi and dystopian stories of female dominance, and it's all sort of comforting to know that they're insects, right? They're not mammals. There's nothing like that happens in the mammal kingdom. There is actually a mammal that behaves like a social insect, whose society is classed as eusocial, where there is a designated queen that does all the reproducing, and then all the other members of the community service only her reproductive needs and never reproduce themselves. And that creature is this, the naked mole rat. Anybody here familiar with naked mole rats? Yeah, I thought this might be a crowd that knows the naked mole rat. I happen to think naked mole rats are incredibly cute. I really do. I went to see, I've always wanted to see them my whole life, because they're fascinating creatures, because they have this eusocial lifestyle. They live in these communities underground in East Africa. But they're incredibly hard to see in the wild, because they always live underground. I mean, you can understand why. You're not going to come above ground with skin like that, are you, in the equatorial sun? And I really wanted to see them for myself. And I got in touch with Dr. Chris Fawkes at Queen Mary in London, who invited me to his hot cupboard in East London, where he's got a whole colony of naked mole rats. He, by the way, I should say, he also thinks they're cute, but he did say that they look like a penis with teeth, which I don't think it speaks terribly well of Chris, if I'm honest. But anyway, back to his hot cupboard, where he invited me to meet his wrinkly pink tyrant. Those are actually his words. But anyway, I went nevertheless. And Chris is a fantastic. He's a wonderful man, and he's spent the last 20 years cultivating this colony in East London in the most kind of Heath Robinson affair. That he's created a facsimile of their strange underground life using a load of plastic tubing and Tupperware boxes. But it's enabled him to decode their society, which is incredibly fascinating. There is just one female that reproduces. She has 1 or 2 male mates, but there's only one female. And the rest of the colony can't reproduce because they never go through puberty. They're sexually immature. So somehow, just like with the social insects, she's repressing their sexuality. So unlike the meerkat, she doesn't have to expel anybody from the colony because they just don't become sexually reproductive. And Chris has been working out how and why that happens. And what he's worked out is that the queen does this by being basically a big royal bully. So unlike the social insect queen that hangs around in her royal chamber and just doesn't ever move because she's too enormous, if you're the queen mole rat, you're on constant patrol. So she goes on this constant tour. Now, I'm going to guess, can we play that first video? Here we go. So you'll see her. She walks over and shoves all of her subjects. She clambers over them, and she'll bite them. And, annoyingly, I've put the wrong video in here. I do apologize. Here we go. So we see some shoving there, and we should see some biting as well. Yeah. So yeah, she clambers over and she's basically physically exerting her dominance the whole time. And what this does is the stress of that messes with their hormones. And yeah, this is the wrong video I've given, as you can see. You can stop it now. Thank you very much. Before my appalling unedited camera work, I do apologize. It's because the video in the slide didn't work, and at the last minute I had to replace it off my laptop, so it was a bit of a quick thing, so apologize for that. But yeah, what you miss in that unedited clip is the queen actually actively pulling one of their tails and sort of biting them. So this creates a lot of stress, basically, and it messes with their hormone levels, so they remain sexually immature. So all of which makes the British royal family suddenly seem quite reasonable, actually. But you'll be pleased to hear that female dominance isn't quite so brutal always. These are orcas, or danger dolphins, as you may know them. They are the biggest member of the dolphin family. They've got a fairly kind of unwelcoming nickname as killer whales, but they're not actually whales. As I say, they're members of the dolphin family, and they are basically. We always thought that orcas were male dominant, of course, because males are bigger than females. And that was what everybody assumed, and they hang out as same in these family pods. But it turns out that the males are not the leaders of orca society. It's actually the females. In fact, it's the post-menopausal grannies who are the leaders of orca society. Yeah, I know. So as a woman of a certain age, this story screamed at me so loud I had to go and investigate. And it turns out, because the thing is menopause is incredibly rare in the animal kingdom. Basically, if you stop reproducing, you die. And all the species that we know of that go through menopause were captive. There was sort of some captive great apes like gorillas who in zoos were known to live beyond their reproductive fitness. But that was because they were being provided with free meals and healthcare, so they actually outlived their ovaries. So it was, for a long time, it was thought that human females were the same, that we were basically propped up by modern medicine and regular feeding, and actually we should be dying out alongside our ovaries round about now, in my case. So. But it turns out, hooray, we're not alone. We are not the only animals that naturally go through menopause. We're joined by these creatures, 4 species of toothed whales. We've got orcas, short-fin pilot whales, narwhals, and beluga whales. So that's kind of an eclectic collection, isn't it? Us and them. What's the connection? Well, as it turns out, the most studied are, of course, the orcas, and they've been studied for a long time off the coast of Washington, and they've got like 30 years of data there that we've been able to study and find out that really it's all to do with social systems. So the reason why the females stop reproducing halfway through their age, it's almost the same as with humans. The female orcas go through menopause at around about 40, but they'll live till they're like 80 or 100. Or they can do if there's enough food for them to eat in the ocean, which unfortunately isn't always the case anymore. But the female orcas stop reproducing halfway through their life so that they don't compete with their daughters. So they basically invest in their daughters and their sons' offspring and their offspring instead. So it's a way of solving that competition. And now you might be wondering, how do you study menopause in a 6-ton swimming torpedo with teeth? It's not that easy to take blood samples on a daily basis. Well, what you need to do is you need to take fecal samples. And I went out to the coast of Washington and spent a day with Dr. Giles, who is in charge of doing that. Here she is at work on her boat with her assistant, Eba the dog. Because actually, even though, as Dr. Giles told me, whales do big ones, floaters, they are still hard to find. So she's got this former rescue dog from Sacramento, Eba, who she's retrained to sniff out whale scat. Amazing, right? She can smell it from a nautical mile away. And that's Eba in her office, hard at work. I have to say, the thing that I found really difficult was to decipher the signals that the dog was giving off for where the scat was. That kind of seemed miraculous to me. But anyway, Dr. Giles and Eba have a thing going on and are able to communicate somehow, and they collect these samples. And these samples are obviously incredible. As Dr. Giles says, poop is a gold mine, because you've got all sorts of hormones in there. You've also got stress hormones as well as obviously all the sex hormones, and that's how they're able to study where the females in the groups are within their cycle. And what they've also been able to discover is what an incredibly inclusive society that the orcas have, which I found really inspiring. This individual here has scoliosis, has a bent spine, you can see from the bent fin there, and isn't able to swim as fast as the other orcas. So you might think that that individual might not be able to catch fish as well and may not therefore live as long. But actually, that individual was studied for many years and lived a long and healthy life because it was supported by the community. And, the matriarch would catch fish and share them with that individual. And despite being called killer whales, orcas have an incredible capacity for empathy, possibly, very likely, even greater than ours, because they have, as well as having like this huge 7-kilo brain, which has more surface area for cognitive thought than any other animal on the planet, they also have an extra lobe, the paralimbic lobe, which only dolphins and orcas have, which where it sits in the brain suggests that they're able to process empathy and emotions in a realm that we can't possibly understand. And, if anybody's seen those incredible videos, I think they were on the latest Attenborough series of them hunting seals off ice floes. It's an incredibly coordinated activity, and you can sort of see how they have this extraordinary social connection. And, I felt very moved by their inclusive society and couldn't help but wish that perhaps our leaders could grow a paralimbic lobe. And be a little bit more inclusive. But what about primates? We sort of think patriarchy is burnt into our DNA. And that's the story that we tell our kids, right? So this is, a lot of you I can tell recognize, this is King Julian from the movie Madagascar, and King Julian was the king of Madagascar. Well, if you go to Madagascar, King Julian is nowhere to be found because King Julian is a ring-tailed lemur. Ring-tailed lemurs are a female-dominant society. There is no King Julian to be found. I went to Madagascar, and females are aggressively dominant. They are the same size as males, and you know, if males have any food that they want or sleep spots that they want, then they will whack them and just grab it, and the males are helpless to do anything about it. It's not to say that female dominant societies are any nicer than patriarchal ones, by the way. That's a myth. But so here we have. Oh, this is the second video. Hopefully, this is the right one. Yeah, here we go. So these are female lemurs doing what they like doing best in the morning, which is sunning themselves. They like to start the day with some warm sun and sunbathe like a boss. Yeah, I sort of fell in love with the lemurs. I just thought that was so incredibly charming. It isn't just female ring-tailed lemurs that are dominant. I met several, there's like 111 species of lemur in Madagascar, which I urge you all to go. If you can, take your tourist dollars, spend them in Madagascar. It's the most astonishing place, very poor, but with the most incredible wildlife. And these are some of the lemurs that I met. There's everything from, and these are primates. These are our most sort of ancient primate cousins. You've got everything, the world's smallest primate, which is the dwarf lemur there, and then the indri, which is the biggest of all the lemurs, which is about this big, and it's looks like a teddy bear. I mean, it's an astonishing looking creature. But these are all female dominant. So what's interesting about that is, from a taxonomic point of view, you have, 90% of the 111 lemur species are female dominant, but the other prosimians, the bush babies and the galagas, they're also female dominant. And of course, they're all primates, so don't look like it, but when you look at their hands, you can see that sort of connection with us a bit more. And given that all the prosimians are female dominant, it suggests that the ancestor of all primates was actually female dominant. But yet, when we think about dominance amongst primates, we always think of these characters, don't we? We think of chimpanzees, because they're our closest relative. We share 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees. And these are male chimps, all riled up and ready for a fight. And chimpanzee society is, certainly amongst the chimps in West Africa, patriarchal and warlike. And it's been used as a model for human ancestry ever since we discovered chimpanzees and how close we were related. And it paints a pretty depressing picture. But thankfully, there is another great ape that we are equally closely related to, who I'm sure a lot of you in this room will be familiar with, and that is the bonobo. And bonobos are known as pygmy chimpanzees. They are smaller and they have less hair. This sassy character here, this is Loretta, and her lack of hair demonstrates her status because she gets groomed such a lot. She's gone a bit bald. Dr. Amy Parish, who's been studying Loretta and bonobos for a long time, said she looks a bit like Shrek. Which I think is a little bit unfair. But what Dr. Amy Parish discovered is that bonobos, who share exactly the same amount of DNA with us as chimpanzees, 99%, their society, instead of being patriarchal and warlike, is actually matriarchal and peaceful. And this is really interesting because with bonobos have the same sexual size dimorphism as chimpanzees. So males are bigger than females. So the sort of lazy interpretation of that is, oh, males must be dominant over females then because they're bigger. Well, no, actually, they're not. The females are actually dominant over the males because they formed an incredibly strong coalition, a strong sisterhood. But what's interesting about this sisterhood is the females in that sisterhood are not related to one another. So often you'll get females cooperating if they're kin, but as we've seen, even amongst kin, females can be incredibly competitive with one another. But certainly unrelated individuals were always thought to be competitive with one another and wouldn't be cooperative. Well, that's not true with the bonobos. The females the females tend to disperse. So when they join a troop, they're not related to the other females. And instead of competing with them, they have sex with them. And this sex basically forms strong bonds between them, and all that oxytocin takes away all of that competitiveness and aggression, and so they form this very cohesive sisterhood. So that means that basically the female and that means that they're able to overpower the males. So the females are dominant to the males. And so basically, the female bonobo has overthrown the patriarchy through ecstatic same-sex frottage, which is one way of doing it. But what does this teach us? Well, it shows us that dominance is flexible and that it's not associated necessarily with size. It's not necessarily a given that males are dominant over females if they're bigger. It also shows the power of a female sisterhood, females grouping together in order to stand up to males. And it also shows the flexibility of sexuality, which is something that has been ignored in science for a long time because it was thought of as a sort of an inconvenient sort of Darwinian problem. Why would animals waste energy on sex if they're not reproducing? Well, because it feels good. We're wired, females are wired, males are wired. Sex is something that feels good, and it also is a great way of forming strong social bonds. It serves lots of functions in nature, we now understand, other than just reproduction, which is another one of those incredibly Victorian ideas that sex is just about reproduction. Of course it isn't. There are lots of animals that have recreational, heterosexual and same-sex sexual activity. There's a lot of it. But this sort of view of the animal kingdom through these sort of heteronormative goggles has very much biased our understanding. And this is a very great example of that. This is a Laysan albatross. And I met this albatross on the island of Hawaii, where they've been studied for over 50 years, this particular colony. And the thing about albatross is they're sort of like this, they're like another great paragon of monogamy, of heterosexual monogamy. In fact, when Barbara Bush visited the island of Laysan, she commended the albatross in a speech for their wonderful commitment to heterosexual monogamy. What she didn't realize when she made that speech was that a third of the albatrosses in her colony were, to put it anthropomorphically, lesbians. So basically, female albatross, but basically the albatross in this colony, there's been for a long time they've been studied, and there was this anomaly that you'd have nests with 2 eggs in them, right? And an albatross, a female albatross, can't lay 2 eggs because it's too energetically expensive. They can only lay 1 at a time. They can't raise 2 chicks either. So there were lots of sort of silly excuses that were given for these 2 eggs, until Lindsay Young, who's in the back of that picture, came along, and she went, well, we actually checked that they are males and females that are on these nests. And of course nobody had, because males and females are identical, so they just assumed that the couples with the nests were male and female. So she went round and she took feathers from each of the nests and took them to the lab and checked the DNA. And she found that a third of the couples on this colony were actually female-female couples. And she was so amazed by her results, she went back and did the lab work 2 more times because she just thought, no one's going to believe me. This is extraordinary. Like, how has this happened? So the reason why this has happened is because this particular colony, and it's the same, there are other colonies on other Hawaiian islands that have more or less the same ratio. The reason why is because the females on this colony are pioneers in every sense of the word. Most Laysan albatross nest on Laysan Atoll, which is going to be gone in a few years because it's just completely flat atoll. So these are sort of striking out to pastures new and formed a new colony. I mean, it's actually nearly 100 years old, but it's new in albatross terms. And so the females in this colony what happens with albatross is it's the females that are more likely to disperse and nest outside of where they were born. The males tend to nest where they were born. So these new colonies have more females than males. Now, those females want to mate, they want to have chicks, but you can't do that alone. You need to have another partner because it takes 6 months for an albatross chick to fledge. So, you've got to feed that. You've got to do tag team for flying miles in order to get the food to feed that chick. So you've got to have a partner. So what the females are doing in this case is they are mating with other albatross husbands that are already in partnerships with other females, and then hooking up with another female in order to raise the chicks. Both females will lay an egg. Only one of those eggs ever survives. And it's pretty random, Lindsay says, which one it is. They don't seem to recognize their own eggs in particular, but one just sort of naturally ends up falling away. And so they have a pretty good strike rate. It's not as good as the heterosexual couples, but it's pretty good. And some of these partnerships just last one season, but some of them just work. In fact, I met one couple there who've been together 17 years, and they've had 8 chicks and 3 grandchicks together. They're amongst the most successful couples on the colony. And Lindsay said, they've just got what it takes. They communicate well, and they just, they just get on. They're just a good couple. She said, you'll just find everything amongst albatross. She said, it's the same as humans. You'll find couples who divorce a lot. You'll find couples who work well in couples. You'll find couples that females work better with other females. And when, albatross spend 6 months on the wing, and then at the end of that, when they reunite, they do these elaborate dances. And the females in this couple, they do exactly the same thing when they reunite. They do the same amazing dances and lovey-dovey cooing and preening and mounting, all that behavior that releases bird oxytocin that keeps that bond strong. So behaviorally, they're the same as heterosexual couples. Which again is another demonstration of the flexibility of sexuality and sex roles in nature. But while I was on Hawaii, I met an animal that's taken things even further and dispensed with males altogether. And that's this character. This is the mourning gecko, Leptodactylus lugubris. And this female is part of a species that is all female. There are no males in existence. And the mourning gecko evolved out of a species that did reproduce sexually. But actually, they evolved to, when they form their sex cells, their eggs, they're able to fuse, and so they don't need sperm in order to complete them. They actually, their process of meiosis completes the process, so they're able to form perfect clones of themselves. So each female produces 2 eggs, about the size of Tic Tacs, and each one will be a perfect clone of herself. What's sort of fascinating about this, actually lots of species are capable of this. Most of them are microscopic, but there's quite a few vertebrates, and in fact it's something we're discovering more and more. Now we're removing the binary goggles and looking at nature in a different way. There was a California condor, wild California condor, that was found recently to reproduce by cloning as well as sexually. But there are also these species, the Brahminy snake, that's an all-female species, which have completely dispensed of males. And of course, what's interesting about this is it goes back to the oldest story of all, of course, which is that woman was produced out of Eve was. I've been atheist for so long. I really struggle with this. Can't even remember what the bloody legend is. Can't even remember what the legend is. It's Eve was produced out of Adam's rib, wasn't it? I think it was, wasn't it? Anyway, what bullshit that was, because Adam was produced out of Eve. Because, of course, these cloning females are just reverting back to what, before sex, all species were asexual. Before the evolution of sex, all species reproduced asexually. They cloned themselves. So they were females. So males arrived on about several billion years later, and I spoke to this scientist David Cruz, who's tracked this back, and there's a bunch of evidence for the fact that the original sex was female and males evolved out of females. And this is a really, really important thing to understand, because it explains why these sort of binary ideas of males and females and the two things being completely distinct categories is so nonsense, is because basically we are made out of the same bodies, basically the same genes, the same brains, the same hormones. And nowhere is this more evident than in animals that are actually able to change sex. Here are anemone fish at home in their anemone. And anemone fish, females are dominant. They form partnerships with males, and they'll live in an anemone together. It's so difficult to say this. In an anemone together with 2 or 3 immature males. And that's their unit. And but if you take the dominant female out, then the male transforms into the dominant female. Her male partner transforms into a dominant female. And one of the immature males then goes through puberty and becomes sexually mature and becomes their sexual partner. And now, of course, these fish were made famous by Finding Nemo. So a biologically accurate version of Finding Nemo, in which little Nemo lost his mum, went on a great adventure and was reunited with his dad at the end of the movie, would of course had a very different ending. But it's incredibly important to study these fish, because what they do is and Justin Rhodes has been studying them for many years, and what he can tell is that it's fascinating. When you take that dominant female out, the male that's left behind almost immediately starts behaving like a female and is recognized as a fish. Is recognized as a female. So he's recognized as a fish. So the male that's left behind almost immediately starts behaving as a female because she's really aggressive with other females, and she's recognized as a female by the other fish. But her gonads take up to a year to change from being testes to ovaries. So what's interesting about this, of course, is biological sex is defined by whether you produce eggs or sperm. So and I said Justin had all these tanks of fish, and he had some fish that were in the middle of this change. And I was like, so what sex is that fish then? And he went, well, that's a really good question, isn't it? Because biologists would tell you that fish is male because it's got testes, but all the other fish would tell you that fish is female. So I think it's really interesting that you'll see that in that fish, gender identity, which is not something that we can talk about in animals. We don't talk about gender because you can't ask animals what gender they are. But that animal is telling us that it's female, but yet its biological sex is male. So gender identity is uncoupled from biological sex, which I think is very interesting. So when we look now at those differences between males and females, there aren't really any that we can speak of. And I think it's really important to understand the diversity of the female experience within the animal kingdom, because it helps us understand the diversity that we find in our own species. And understand that the female experience is diverse, it's plastic, and it refuses to conform to archaic stereotypes. And I think the more we can understand that, the more we can appreciate the natural world and empathize for our own species. Thank you very much. And there's my book.